You are listening to the Hostage to the Devil podcast. Some listeners may find this content disturbing.
Hi, Michael, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's an honor to be able to finally talk with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Am I right in saying, did you contact me after seeing the film, or how do we get in touch in the first place?
Well, I was writing the book over COVID, and I was talking to my girls. I have girls that are like 30 years old.
Yeah.
And I was talking to them, and I was basically, my inclination to write the book was for the story for my kids and my grandkids, because, nobody wants to talk about this stuff. It's not something I sit down over dinner and talk about, to my kids, but they all want to know, but they have young kids, and, we don't have time to talk about this. It's not something you can say in 5 minutes. So I started writing the book for them. I can say, okay, this is what happened to your dad. Here you go. As I was going through the process of it, my girls would ask me, so how's the writing coming along, Dad, and stuff like this. And I said, it's coming along good. And they would keep telling me, listen, you've got to make this public, because you have told us for so many times that, you wish someone would know what was going on with you. So because I didn't really know that anything was wrong, believe it or not. But my girl said, you've got to do it for, even if there's one person out there that may be going through the same thing. So I took that to heart. But I still wasn't convinced, because they were telling me, go public with it. And it wasn't I was almost done. And then I happened to be at home. I had just finished a chapter, and I put Netflix on, and I found your documentary. I'm a guy who's into documentaries, because documentaries, for the most part, they tell the truth. They're highly scrutinized, and a lot of information and time goes into it. I don't like movies per se, because there's a lot of liberations going on in the movies. So, but I love documentaries, and I happened to find that. And once I had finished watching it, the first thing I did was look up who the producer was, and I saw your name, and I said, you know what? I said to myself, I'm going to send this guy a message. Probably won't get in contact with me, but regardless, I'm going to send him a message, because this guy sounds like a guy who, if I told him my story, he wouldn't be like, wow, what a freak, or, you're telling a big lie to sell books, or what have you. So getting in contact with you and having you, correspond with me was the final nail that helped me realize that I should go public. You are actually the very first person publicly that doesn't know me. And, not a whole lot of people know my story, just a very immediate family and a few other people, and that's it. But, I was really looking for, hey, are people on the outside going to think, just going to discount me off as some sort of crazy guy, or seeking for attention, or anything like that. So you were the first one, and your response was very important to me. It was going to determine, where I was going to go with the next step with this, whether I was going to make it public, because I was on the fence about it at that time. Yeah. And when I got a positive response from you, I was like, and, I have to credit you for giving me that, giving me some time, basically, to just kind of chat with you. And, you said you wanted the book, you had some interest in reading it. And that was the first outsider. You were the first outsider that I was able to bounce this off of, and get, I'm not going to say it's a positive response, because, people don't say, oh, great story, but, it was the first, hey, you're not crazy. Hey, you took me for what it was, because, this isn't some sort of, big lie to make money selling books or anything like that. I spent 40 years not talking about this until finally I was ready. And this is how it just came about. So that's kind of how we got together. You put the nail in the coffin for me when I told my wife. Yeah, I told my wife, listen, I've talked to Martin a couple of He knows what he's talking about. He's seen this guy. He's talked to people. He's looked in their eyes. He's done the research. This is more than just a story. You have to do research to really dig and become knowledgeable about something. And that's exactly what I am. I'm a real detective about things. And that's kind of what spurred the whole process along.
But I mean, plus the stories about your life as well and your own mother. So you've got to be very diligent with your research and your, in the way you approach this book. And I'll be honest with you, I am a normal person. Like filmmakers and actors and other people, the general public put them on a pedestal, and I'm just a normal, down to earth guy, and I'll listen to anybody who has a story to tell. And yeah, yours from the get go was something that felt fresh in a subject matter that had been done 1,000 times, and yeah, you came across really well and nice. And rather than keep talking about the book, we'll go into that in a few minutes. But had you become aware of Father Martin's work before the documentary, or did the documentary sort of was that the first time you'd heard about the man?
Well, I had heard about them because before your Netflix project came out,
yeah,
I had listened to all the Art Bell interviews with Malachi. I think there was, I don't know, maybe 14 hours worth. I mean, I listened to all those, and the reason why I listened to all those, it wasn't specifically for Martin Malachi, but it was, during my 40s, because I'm 53 right now, I began to study all of these exorcisms from the 13th century on. I got every transcript, I got every video, I got every tape, every audio recording, and delved heavily into it to find, because like I said before, I'm like a detective. I put my mother's picture on a wall and then began to form a story around it by all these other exorcisms and all this other information, and began to draw all the lines and the timelines and the characteristics. Because like I said before, when we were growing up in this, we had no idea what it was. We had no idea what was going on because it was so gradual and so slow, and it happened over so many years. Obviously, the last 6 or 7 years were extremely horrific, but still, I was so indoctrinated, and so was my sister, that, we didn't go running to school, hey, you gotta see what's happening over at my house. That never entered my mind, because it was such a gradual, slow thing. Even when it became extremely horrific, it wasn't something that we talked about. We didn't even talk about it at home. It was very, very strange. Can
you give us the synopsis for the audience? We keep talking about sort of the book. Let's tell the audience now specifically what the book is about.
Well, it starts, in my early childhood when I was 3 years old, and the whole book, and I don't mean it to be about my mother, it's really about me and surviving this. But from the age of 3, I received a traumatic experience by my mother. She dumped a pot of burning hot soup over my shoulder, and that was the beginning of it. And then in the next couple of years after that, we're talking 1970, 72, 73. She was telling us, and she wasn't telling me, but I was overhearing this, that she began to hear voices. She began to hear thumping and scratching in the wall and all these various, as we would say today, paranormal activity. And this increased. And then by, I think, 1975 is when we lived in suburbia in Toronto, and then we moved to a rural town 120 miles away that was only 4,500 people. But my dad still worked in Toronto, so we moved all the way up there, and then he had to drive all the way back down there. So we were completely isolated, no family. And from this moment on in 1975, no one ever came and seen us. No one ever came and visited us, save one time that my, Italian family never even came in the house. But from then on is where my mother's escalation began. She not only began to hear voices, she began to talk, she began to whistle, she began to talk in different languages, began to argue. Then she became extremely blasphemous and wicked and screaming, and it became horrific. By the time I was 16, she attempted murder on my sister, and then they took her away in a straitjacket to the mental institution, and 3 months later she was back. And she continued this same behavior, and then she was taken away again after attacking me and my father, and then they brought her back another 3 months later. And at that time, my sister had already left because she was 7 years older than me. And I made a beeline for California. I was living in Ontario at the times. And as soon as I turned 18, I made plans to get out, and to move to California. I actually came to California. I was 19 years old and living under the Santa Monica Pier. And that's basically the gist of the first book. And coming to find out over the next 30, 40 years, is that what I discovered was that she was incredibly and completely demonically possessed. And now that I look over it and have studied for decades, now I see it was horrific at the time. There was something definitely, she wasn't normal. There were incredible paranormal things going on, but we were never able to, we lived in a small town. We were Italian. My father didn't speak English very well. He was never home, came home for a few hours on the weekend and then was gone. It was just me and my sister, and she lived in her room with the lock on her door. And even though I lived with her for 8 years, I barely saw her. She came out, grabbed food, went back in her room and locked the door. I never saw her.
What was the reason for moving in 1975 to that rural area then? What was the motivation to do that?
I'm not really sure, but that's the odd thing, is that we moved all the way up there, and then he had to work all the way back down 120 miles away. I'm not really sure, but I think that there was some sort of dynamics with my mother and my mother's sister at the time, because I remember when I was very young, they were into seances, and there might have been swinging and stuff going on, but something happened in the family dynamic, and my dad decided that he needed to get out of Dodge, and we move 120 miles away, but yet he still has to drive all the way back down to Toronto. I still to this day don't know.
What do you feel were the origins of this obsession and possession?
Well, after talking to my sister, she filled in a few gaps for me because she's 7 years older than me. She told me that before I was born, her father, who she adored, she absolutely adored the man, he was killed in a train accident in Toronto, in that area. He was drunk, stumbled onto a train track, and the train came and cut his legs off and killed him. And she was just horrified at that. And I think, and this isn't just coming up with some more idea of what happened, because I remember being very young, and my parents and my aunt, who was my mother's sister, they would talk about seances, and I would hear them talk about this. I never even knew what the word meant, but I kept it in my head. And then years later, I found out what it was, and that it still didn't mean anything to me. But I think that's what happened is, back in those days in the late 60s and the early 70s, seances and gathering around a table and trying to elicit a response from dead loved ones and stuff like this was really happening back then. Same with swinging, and all that kind of thing. And I think that's what my mother did, because I heard tales of my grandmother, who, when she lost him, she loved him so much too, she couldn't handle it. She went out and partied and left my mother, who was the eldest of 3, to take care of the kids. And she was devastated. She was absolutely devastated. And I think this was the invitation. This was the opening here, was that her and her sister began to do these seance things, because I remember all through the years growing up, them talking about seances. My aunt had a cousin that was my age, 1 year older than me, and we used to talk about our parents and ESP and things of that day, in the 70s. So I really think that was the entry point right there. I really do believe it.
So you're in a remote area. Your dad's hardly around. It's you and your sister and your mother. Can you talk me through? You've just moved to this area, this new house. Talk me through the behaviour and the sort of disintegration of your mother's health, and also her erratic behaviour gets intensifies. Talk me through those early stages and what you experienced as a young boy.
Right. Well, in 1975 is when we moved up there. It was my first year in kindergarten. And right from then, when we moved up there, she was, just talking to herself, walking around the house, talking to herself. And, that wasn't uncommon. It was kind of weird, but it increased every year to her talking to herself and not even aware that we're there. And then after, probably by 1979, 1980, her conversations were full-blown conversations, talking to multiple people. And then maybe around 1980, 1981, it got into talking with multiple people. And then her voice is changing, and I mean, we're talking about a woman here she was 4'11". And by that time, she had very short vocal cords. So she had a very high voice, and she was emitting these guttural, manly tones out of her from these voices. And they would change on a dime, like one ask a question and the other, say something or respond back, and just many different voices. And then it grew into not only were there many voices, then it became angry, extremely violent. And then it became, it didn't just become, but it escalated to languages. I mean, I was having a hard time understanding anything she said because I didn't understand what she was saying. And, at that point, I'm just a kid. And, we're all kind of just, she's crazy, and we're not discounting. But I'll tell you, that had such an effect on me that today, as a 53-year-old, I speak almost 5 languages that I learned on my own because I hated being in the dark and not understanding what she was saying. And that had an effect on me later on in life, that I couldn't stand it when people would talk like that. It was a post-traumatic stress for me, that not being able to understand what somebody was saying. So I started learning languages, and I didn't go to school or anything. I learned them by myself. And it got so bad that not only was she doing these, speaking in different languages and these guttural tones and laughing hysterically, whistling, for hours on end. This activity, this behavior went on from sunset to sundown. And by 1980, 1982, she was hitting herself with a log. And she was just whacking herself in the chest with a log while she was having these conversations. And it never ended. I would leave in the morning because I couldn't handle the stress of being there. I would leave at like 7:30 in the morning, and take off and go up the river and come back at sunset. And I would be parking my bike outside, and, we'd have all the windows open, and I'd park my bike and I could hear the thudding from outside. And I would walk inside, and she's still hitting herself in the chest. Her chest is beet red, and she's just whacking herself with this log. And then sometimes, she'd have a boot in the other hand, and she'd be whacking herself on the head with a boot. And the crazy thing about it was she would do this behavior, and, I would be standing in the room, and it was like I wasn't even there. In fact, there were times where I think I was around 16 years old at the time. I had become so distressed by her behavior that I would go right up to her face, almost touching noses, and scream obscenities in her face to stop. And she wouldn't even react. She wouldn't even break out of these voices. There was a couple times where she just stopped for a minute and stared at me directly into my eyes, and just stared at me, and it freaked me out, and I backed off, and then one split second later, boom, she was right back into it. It just never ended. It never ended. And then when the sun went down, that's where she would retreat from her chair that she always sat in, which I have to mention, by that time, she must have weighed 260 pounds, and she bottomed out the chair, and she was eating like a ravenous animal. I mean, anything that was in the house, she was eating, and she had been doing this for years, like a ravenous animal, so much so that, when I was a kid, I grew up stealing lunches at school. I grew up in the summer times, obviously, because this was Canada. I stole vegetables out of the garden, and that had an impact on me because I'm a vegetarian to this day, because I stole and ate so many vegetables. I'd pick, vegetables out of this guy's garden that was attached to our backyard, because back in those days, we didn't have fences in Canada. Everybody's backyard was just one big conglomerate of green grass. And he had this massive garden. And when I was hungry, I'd go out there, steal carrots, celery, take them down to the creek, wash them off and eat them. And I did that for maybe a decade, and it got so bad that she was, eating everything in the house, that my dad had to take what food we did have when he was there. He'd put it down in this big, huge freezer. Back in the 70s, we had these freezers that were, you could stuff a body in. They were big. And my dad put a big, heavy chain on it and a lock, because she was literally eating us out of house and home. She had no teeth in her head. The teeth that she did have were all broken. And she would wag her tongue at me, just out of nowhere, whether she was doing it to me or not, I'm not quite sure. But you could see she'd stick her tongue out so far, you could see that the sides of her tongue were so serrated like a knife, because her teeth were all broken. And of course, they were getting chewed up, by her tongue, bleed, and then heal. So you'd have these bumps, kind of like when you get a canker sore. And her tongue was just this grotesque, appendage that she would stick out and wave, back and forth, kind of like Gene Simmons from Kiss, except from side to side,
As a small child, what was going through your head? But what did you think did you think your mum just lost her marbles, or what was going through your head as a young boy, and your sister's head? Was there any support? Did the church get involved? Like psychiatrists get involved at this stage? What was going through your head, and what was the support for you and your sister at the time?
Well, there was nothing going through my head. I had no idea what was going on. And, like I said before, I wouldn't run to school and tell my friends, oh, you should see what's happening it was completely normal for me, because we grew up in this. It was slow, it was methodical, and it was 12 plus years. So my sister and I, we still don't talk about it to this day. My sister's in complete denial over it. And as far as any religiosity or anybody coming into the picture, as far as, Catholics or Christianity, there was no one, except that my mother had become a Jehovah's Witness before we moved to Meaford. And then when we moved to Meaford, both her and my father were excommunicated. My mother, I don't know why, but my father, this was in the early days, 75, 76, and 77. By 77, she was excommunicated, because I remember having to miss the Muppet Show to go to the Kingdom Hall on a Wednesday night, which just irked me. But for my father, they were saying that he was, back then you had the Pizza Connection, and my father was apparently involved in the mafia. He ran with Luciano Pavarotti and his brother. And, my dad would take me down to these places in Toronto where, you walk in and it's the same guys there every night after night after night, and they don't sell anything. You know what I mean? And yeah. So, my sister.
That sounds like another story in the making. That one, another book in the making.
Yes, yeah. It was very strange, very strange. But we were an extremely disconnected family. We never talked. my father, in fact, it wasn't till a couple of months ago that my dad asked me something, and I said to him, I said, Pop, I've been blacking out. I said, I don't know if you know this, but over the last year, I blacked out like 12 times. I says, this is just something. And he was like, what? And I said, yeah. And he says, well, what's it caused from? And I said, Dad, come on, Mom. And he couldn't say anything. He just,
he sounds like he's like compartmentalized it all and shoved it very deep into his consciousness.
Yeah, well, he grew up in World War II. He was 5 years old during the war. And then after the war, he spent 4 years in Sabaudia, which was a refugee camp. And then he lived in general housing made by the government with him and his 6 brothers in a small apartment. So he didn't have life very good either, So that he has post-traumatic stress as well. And he's not able to see, this was the thing. It's like a perfect storm. The father, people always ask me, where was your dad during this? Yeah. And I said, my dad was absent. And for one thing, he doesn't speak English that well because he's from Italy, And the other thing is that he's, traumatically, he has post-traumatic stress from the war. Yeah. He saw the Germans shooting at his dad running across the field. Bombs went off while they were hiding. His donkey blew up and all the guts went on him and the kids, his other brothers and sisters. I mean, stuff like that, Yeah. So he's just disconnected.
So talk us through the final moments then. Talk us through the last chapters in the story.
Yeah, well, I had saved up money and I had planned a year in advance to go to California. And apparently, I had 4 other guys that were supposed to go with me, but as the time drew closer, they all bailed until every one of them bailed except for me. The last week before I was going, this was in April, I actually arrived in California on the day after Easter in 1987. That week before, my father had already sold the house, got my mother an apartment in another city about a half an hour away. He said, do you want to see your mother before you take off? Because he knew I wasn't coming back. And I said, sure, I'll go say bye. So I went up to the apartment, it was above a store on Main Street. And, big, long, tall staircase. I went up to the top, knocked on the door. She opened the door. She didn't even look at me. She turned around and walked away. And I just walked in. She didn't even look at me. She didn't even know who it was. I followed her into the bedroom. She sat down on her bed. She reached over to the nightstand. She grabbed an envelope out of it. She handed it to me. And then she lay back down on the bed, and then boom, here came all the voices, and she was talking. And I was like, at that point, I was like, I've bloody had it. I've had it. I took the envelope. I didn't even say bye, I don't think. I just walked out the door. And, a week later, I got on the bus. I had first tried to get a plane ticket over, but the U.S. immigration stopped me because they went, hey, you got $1,000 in your pocket. Here's a guy with long hair, musician. And they went, no way. And they yanked all my gear off the plane. So I had to figure another way of getting across the border. So I went down to my sister's in Toronto and I said, can you drive me over the border in St. Catharines, which is Niagara Falls, into Buffalo, New York there. So they drove me over, and I got on a bus, came out to California. I think it took 3 days. I slept on the Santa Monica Pier. That's a whole nother story. I was scammed by druggies, and I was in Death Wish 4 and I didn't even know it. And in the movie Death Wish 4.
I think you've got at least 6 parts to this. You've got an anthology here of stories.
Yes. Of your life. Yes. Yeah. That is in the book too, which is out now that I already finished. Great. And then I had stayed a few days with my cousin who lived in Upland, California, which was, about an hour and a half away from LA. And I gave them a number. I had met this girl and I gave them a number where they could reach me if there was anything for any reason. About 2 weeks later, they gave me a call and they said, hey, listen, sorry to inform you, but your mother died. And I was like, really? And they said, yeah, she died. And I said, the only reason why they found her is that she was decomposing in her apartment building. And, the stench was wafting over to other units. and they had called the police, and that's when they found her. And the coroner said that it looks like from the decomposition that she had been dead for X amount of days. And they said she probably died on this day. And that was Easter weekend. The Easter weekend was the day that I left for California. So she ended up dying on the day that I left. It was a kind of, washing and wringing of the hands, the mission's over.
Yeah.
She was 46 years old. 46 years old. She had no gray hair, but she was a mess. All her teeth were all in pieces. And
what was the cause of death? Sorry, on the.
Well, they said it was atherosclerosis. So she had eaten herself to death. She gave herself a blood clot, and it killed her. And it was because of her diet. And that's what I was saying. She was eating ravenously. She was like 4'11", and I think the last time I saw her, she was 260 pounds. I mean, she was as wide as she was tall. And my mother wasn't like that. You see the pictures. I don't know if I sent you the book that had the pictures in it, that had the pictures from her wedding and from that Christmas in 57 and 58. She was thin. But, once this thing happened, and that's what my sister said, is that, once this thing happened in Toronto, where she started saying she was hearing voices, this is where she just completely lost it. I mean, I did research on a lot of stuff, and it was kind of like the reverse of the Anneliese Michel case, if you know that one, in Bavaria in 1975. A lot of hellish things happened in the mid 70s, interestingly enough. But she died the opposite. She ate herself to death. And the funny thing is that she probably had diabetes, because I would see her, rubbing her feet together, and she would lift up her leg as high as she could and then dead drop it. And she would do that all day. All these erratic compulsive behaviors all day long for like 14 hours until the sun went down. And so that's eventually what she died of. And I was not shocked at all, because, her eating habits were atrocious. She ate everything to the point where us kids, we didn't have food. We never had food growing up. I mean, I was catching fish down at the local river, coming home and cooking it right away and eating it before anyone else got a chance, because I knew that it would be gone. I only had one chance. And I have that eating disorder to this day, where I inhale, and my wife always tells me, slow down, inhale. Yeah. But I've had, I was conditioned to do that from a small child, was that, when I had food, now was the time to eat as much of it as you can, because it won't be here later on, and that's what I did. And I inhale my food. It's terrible digestion, but I still do that to this day, some 40 years later.
And you say your dad's still alive. Is that correct?
My dad is still alive. He's 88 years old. He still lives in the Toronto area. He moved from Meaford and back down to, another 100 miles away where he used to live. And he's still there. And we never talk about it. I mean, we have a better relationship now. We didn't talk for years. And we never talked growing up either. But Do
you think he holds a lot of obviously unanswered questions that you have and your sister has? Do you think he holds a lot of keys for you both finding some sort of resolution with your mother and her story? Do you think do you feel like he's hiding something or holding on to something?
No. My dad is about as clued out as you can possibly get, and I don't say that in an educational way. I mean, he only has a 4th grade education because of World War II, but he's just was extremely disconnected. He was all about himself, doing what he had to do, and nothing else mattered. I mean, I wore girls' clothes because he didn't provide for us. We grew up like we were in the war with him. We didn't turn the heat on. We didn't turn the lights on. Until it was absolutely. He even turned the heat off in winter. And in Canada, we had to heat our stove. You get minus 70 degrees. I mean, it's bloody cold. And we just had a wood stove, and he well, it's, I chopped wood for a living, basically, as a kid. So, all I can say about him is he was just completely disconnected, no emotional contact with his children, with his wife, or with himself for that matter. It just, and I accredit that to his post-traumatic stress from the war. And we've talked a little bit about it, and I've forgiven him for it too, because I have post-traumatic stress so bad that, I shake at nighttime. I have to be medicated at night or I'll pass out. That's just what happens to me. That's been happening to me for a very, very long time.
Have you sought help about your sort of blackouts and your anxiety and post-traumatic stress? Have you spoken to anybody about this?
Oh, yeah. I've been to psychiatrists. I've been to a number of them over decades. And they were like, a lot of them just said, I can't help you. I'm not familiar with this. This is above my head. And I got referred, I think the last one I went to, they referred me to a POW psychologist who was dealing with guys that, killed children and women in Vietnam. And at that point, because they were telling me, this is the only trauma I can even think of that can relate to what you went through, 12 plus years, So, it was a dead end road.
Is your mum's sister alive, or is she passed on now?
No, she's still alive, and I've been trying to contact her, but I haven't been able to get through. I talked to another aunt of mine because my mother had a sister and a brother, and the brother was the youngest. And I've talked to him and his wife, and they won't give me her phone number for some reason. I've called, and everybody's just so disconnected. So I really think that there was a dynamic back in the early days in the 70s that I think there was, and this is a conjecture for the most part on my part, but I will say I think there was swinging and stuff that destroyed the family, So
when your mother passed away, whatever was sort of tormenting her passed on with her, or was it attached to your mother, do you believe, or do you feel like anything has passed on to yourself or your sister, or have you had any sort of paranormal effects from it, like post your mum passing away?
Lots, in fact. Well, my sister, she is in denial, and I can't really speak on her part, but she just closed up like a clam. As for me, a lot of people ask me, so, when your mom died, you must have felt relief, like it was all over. That was just the beginning. I had no idea, but I had insomnia for probably 18 years. I still have the blackouts. I found out that, by 19, when I'd come to California and started to live a life on my own, that I didn't know how to do life. I I was socially inept. I didn't go through puberty until I was 21 because my chemistry was so suppressed from the trauma. I was a child living in an adult world, and it took me a long time to sort of assimilate. I couldn't talk on the phone. I couldn't, like this interview would have been absolutely impossible.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, it's taken a long time, but, I'm finally able to, like I said, over the 40 years, it wasn't until that I realized what had happened, because we were all in the dark, back then. We didn't talk about it. And then after it happened and it was over, we still didn't talk about it. And then 40 years went by. I had to figure out why I was a mess, because it took me decades to figure out that, by the time I was in lockdown in Yorba Linda for suicide, I realized something's wrong with me. I don't understand how to do life. I'm backwards. I do everything backwards compared to everybody else. I put my shirts on backwards. I have a mild dyslexia. I write things backwards. It's been very traumatic, and I've been able just to do the best I can, but my sister, she's completely clammed up, and my dad, he's just completely clued out.
Do you think you need spiritual help, or do you think you need psychological help moving forward?
Well, when I was in my 20s and I started having kids, that's when I had a mental breakdown, because now I knew, oh my gosh, I have a child, my first daughter, and the pressures of life, then came upon me like, oh my gosh, I'm not equipped for this.
Yeah.
I ended up going to the doctor when I was 23, and they told me I had what's called young man's disease.
Okay.
Yeah, I was like, whatever. They said it was an anxiety about having a family and trying to get ahead. But that's really wasn't what it was. I had post-traumatic stress so
If only they
bad.
knew.
Yeah. And we never talked about those things. They asked about my, background and stuff. And I said, it's fine. I grew up and here I am, It never really became an issue, until I started, it wasn't until I was locked down at Yorba Linda, and I had a guy try to kill me in suicide watch in there. And then that's when I said I had a moment while I was lying in bed. I was lying in bed at this lockdown unit, and some dark figure came over and was whispering in my ear. It was saying a word, and I didn't understand the word, but I remembered it in my head. And it wasn't until years after that I looked up the word, and it meant death in German. And it was calling my name and saying this word over and over and over and over. And that was where I said, something's wrong with me. I had not yet attributed any spiritual nature to anything as of yet.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I had the breakdown. And then what happened after that was my wife and we separated because I was losing my mind. We separated. Then I found out she was pregnant. And then I really lost my mind. And I'll just tell you, this is my testimony. I gave her everything. I had a brand new truck. I gave her the truck. I had so much guilt. I had $7 a week to live on. And I was working at Sebastian Hair Care Products at the time. And there was a lady there who was taking care of me by giving me the food from every public relations event they had. Because, there was like 600 employees, and she would bring me the food. She happened to be Vinnie Vincent's wife from Kiss, the band Kiss. It was her husband. He was the guitar player for Kiss. And she would give me food all the time. So I was losing my mind at that point. I got on a bus. I was going to see her. I was living about 45 minutes away. I was on a bus going down Ventura Boulevard in front of Taft High School. People that live in California know exactly what I'm talking about. Right before the In-N-Out Burger, and you're going down the hill. And right there in front of, I think there was 40 plus people on the bus. I looked up into the heavens and I said, God, whoever you are, I've made a mess of my life. I need you. I'm surrendering to whoever you are. I need your help. I'm losing my mind. I've lost everything, and I don't know what to do. And I began crying on the bus. I was talking out loud. I was crying profusely in front of all these people. And at that minute, I'm not going to say I heard a voice, because I didn't hear a voice, but all of a sudden I had this humongous peace come upon me. And I dried my eyes, and I got to the bus stop, and I was seeing the world now for what it was. This dirty place where people were running about, for personal gain, and all the things that life we don't see, that we don't want to see. Yeah. It's like this veil was pulled away from my eyes. Anyway, when I got off the bus, I ran as fast as I could down the street to where my wife lived. I knocked on the door. She opened up the door. I said, she opened the door. She knew I was coming. So she opened the door, and I said, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. I sat down on the couch. She sat down on the couch with me. She looked at me like I had just lost my mind. And I said, I don't know what happened to me. But things are going to be okay. Let's get back together. Let's do this right. This child needs a mother and a father. And I said, I do love you. I guess I just didn't know what I want. I don't think you knew what you want. I said, if you're willing to do this, let's do this. So at that point, I had no idea what had happened to me, but it didn't go away. The next day and the next week, I was so filled with this. I'm not the same person. And I was thinking, what happened to me? So what I did was I rented Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth. It's like it's an 8-hour epilogue, So I put in the first tape and I was watching the tapes, and, my wife was watching it with me. And then there's a part where Jesus said, "My sheep who know me, they hear my voice." And I looked at my wife with my eyes agaze, and I said, "That's who I met on the bus. That is who I met on the bus." And she looked at me like I was insane. And I said, "That is who I met on the bus. That is who spoke to me. Though I didn't hear an audible voice, that's who spoke to my soul." So from that point, I said, "You know what? I got to go to church. We got to go to church." And she was like, "Okay." So I happened to go to this church. I don't know how I ended up. Oh, I think a friend of mine said, "Oh, you got to try this church out in Simi Valley." I went to this church in Simi Valley. I'm sitting there, and the pastor says, "And this is what it means to be born again." That Jesus said to Nicodemus, "Oh, don't worry about, how can you go back into your mother's womb? That's not what it's about. It's being born again of the Spirit. And all that know me, that hear my voice and respond, shall be born of the Spirit." And I looked over at my wife and I told her, "That's what happened to me. I've been born again. Whatever that is, that's what happened to me." Anyway, to make a long story short, everybody in the family, because, we got get-togethers, barbecues and stuff like this. And the extended family was maybe, I don't know, 25 people, all the brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws and kids and so what have you. They all looked at me like I was Charles Manson. Within 1 month, my wife gave her heart to the Lord on the bathroom floor, crying because she couldn't deal with the person that I had become. There was nothing about me that was the same. Yeah. And then in the next 20 years, 25 more people in my family became Christians, became born again Christians. And that wasn't from me preaching to them, because I didn't know nothing. It was from them seeing what had happened to me, because they knew that I was so messed up. And then all of a sudden I had this incredible stability in my mind, in my soul, in my work, everything that I did. I mean, I still have the scars, which are the passing out. I can't deal with, large crowds, loud sounds that aren't me, because I'm a musician. I can't deal with any of that kind of stuff. I remove myself from all of it, and the blackouts, of course. I'm on medication, of course, because if I don't take the medication, I black out. And, my grandchildren want their grandfather, around, and I want to be here. So that is basically the story in a nutshell. As far as the psychiatrist did nothing for me. They did nothing. And I saw psychiatrists for maybe 20 years, several different ones. It wasn't till that time on the bus that I, quote unquote, became born again, that everything made sense. Then the spiritual realm made sense. Then I knew what happened. Then I began searching the scriptures, began searching all these, exorcist transcripts and everything. Then I discovered what was going on, because it's hard to see the spiritual when you're an unspiritual person. Yeah. Everything's mental illness.
As you mentioned before, once that veil comes off, you can't put it back on. You can't unsee what you've been shown. So it can also be quite an intimidating time in your life where, do I want to go back to the way I was? Not really, no. But it's just gets quite overwhelming, because you can't go back, you can't unsee it, and there's no way of going back and putting that veil back on. Once that comes off, and once you see from a spirituality point of view, there's no going back. And it's a beautiful ride, it's a beautiful journey, but it's also quite intimidating at the same time.
Yeah, it was, it made everything make sense. The demonic, the spiritual realm, our spirits, what we're doing here, what was the cause of that, why my mom would have been. See, now I know, after much research, that the entities that were, because there's never one entity. No. There's never one entity. There's always many. The entities that dwelt in my mother, by her nonetheless, their quest was not to destroy her. It was to destroy me. I was the target. I was the target because I'm the one that they knew later on would profess Christ and bring all of these people in my family, to the foot of the cross, as well as, and in fact, I have a ministry today. I have a ministry today that I talk to people and I help people understand. I mean, I get calls from people dealing with the paranormal and stuff. I look at these guys on TV and all these paranormal shows, and I've talked to many of them. I've talked to the Josh Gates and the Dave Schraders and Ghost Hunters and all these guys. And all these guys, they got it all wrong. They have no idea what they're talking about. They have no idea what they're dealing with. They're not dealing with spirits of some dead girl who died in the 1800s and left a toy on the bed, as a reminder. They have no clue that they're dealing with demonic spirits that want their destruction. And they want that invitation to come in so that they can destroy their lives. I mean, you can go online and research a lot of these paranormal guys. You'll find out that some of them have actually murdered and are in jail because they don't know what they're talking about. And they're delving into an area of life that they don't have protection from. They don't understand. You gotta understand one thing is the first thing, it's entertainment. They're being paid to do this. Yeah. And you can't take that. I think a lot of people that watch these things, they don't understand that perception, even though they know it is, but they don't really think about it. And it doesn't occupy their mind by what they're actually doing and saying, because it's entertainment. And the other part of it is they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, I could put all of these guys out of business by being on their show and coming in and scaring all these entities away. Because, for one thing, they're inviting them and speaking with them. The Bible tells us you're not supposed to, in the Old Testament, you were stoned for trying to communicate. It was, if God prohibited speaking to entities, then how bad must it be? You know what I mean? And here you got these guys running amok with all these silly EVPs and stuff, talking to people, and you get some garbled message, blah, 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 blah. And then they go, oh yeah, he said, get out of here or I'll kill you. Yeah. Who am I talking to? Oh, is it James? James.
My favorite one is the photograph with the yellow circle around it.
Yes.
They're trying to get your attention to this area of the photograph, and they put a big yellow circle around it. I'm like, I still have no idea what you're trying to, get me to look at here. Well, let's. I mean, Michael, I could talk to you all night. Such a great talker, and from someone who was, as you mentioned before, someone who didn't really have friends growing up and didn't really socialize. I could listen to you all night, mate. And I just want to say thank you. And it takes courage to write a story about your own life, including your own family members. So, I respect you for that, and I'd love to see your story on the big screen sometimes. And I'm sure, with three of our mutual friends and anyone listening to this, I would love to sort of see this story on the big screen, mate. Before we leave, can you guide people to where they can find your book, and what is your book called, and where can they find it?
Well, right now it's only available on not Netflix, Amazon Kindle, and it's Amazon. So if you have Amazon Kindle, Amazon Prime, or Amazon Unlimited, Kindle Unlimited, you'll actually get it for free. But both books are now up there. I'm currently writing a third and a fourth book right now. The third book is just my humor as a kid growing up. It's a 180-degree turn. It's about the fun things I did when I was a kid, all the great laughs I had in school, and just being a class clown. And it's really a diversion from all of this yuck. And then I got a fourth book I'm working on, which is called The Fallen Memoirs, which is where I'm taking the things that my mother said and actually incorporating them into a dialogue of demonic entities as they travel through the earth looking for, suspects to inhabit. And that's coming from it's coming from their perspective. It's going to be very heavy.
That's an interesting POV as well. Okay, tell us the name of your first two books.
It's Devil Take the Hindmost, a story of terror, a true story of terror, and then it's Devil Take the Hindmost Part 2, The Aftermath, which, encompasses from the 19 years old sleeping under the pier to 53 to talking with Marty Stalker today.
Brilliant. We're going to leave it there. If you're listening to this, I'll put links in the podcast description, but yeah, go and download the book. And it's a fascinating read and a really interesting sort of point of view with regards to the whole world of demonic. Yeah, it's been refreshing to talk to you, Michael. And like I said before, thank you. And I've a lot of respect for you to finally put pen to paper. And I'm glad I was some sort of influenced in that decision, but obviously we'll keep in touch anyway.
Thank you, Marty. Really appreciate it. It's been an honor.
All right, Michael. See you soon, mate. Good luck.
Okay, bro. Thank you,
mate. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to our podcast, and remember about our Facebook page where you can find out more information about our documentary. If you have some spare cash, then please buy us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/HTTD podcast to help us keep this podcast going. And it would only be right to finish with the main man himself.
Luciferian tradition is a very disturbing thing, and most people, Catholics included, and most bishops, and we have 4,700 bishops now in the Catholic Church, most of them don't want to talk about it, don't want to reflect on it. It's a very disturbing fact. And the fact is that demonic possession has increased. Well, I started doing anything in exorcism about 1970 of this century, and since then the incidence of possession and obsession, demonic possession and demonic obsession, has increased about 740 to 800%. The phenomenon has changed. We are now facing groups of 20-somethings or 30-somethings coming to us and saying, look, I made a pact with the devil, with Satan, with Lucifer, however they use it, because I wanted a job, I wanted this woman, I wanted the career, I wanted the money, and I got it all, and now he won't let me go. Please help me.